psychological disorder, anxiety disorders. And the way that we're going to look at this is we're always, everything we're learning, we're going to tie it back to what we already know. We know that if you learn the facts so that you can pull them back up easier, if you understand everything in terms of this conceptual framework, the last classes we spent the time going over and looking at what psychology is, what abnormal behavior has to do with it, and what are the functions, and what are the criteria for abnormal behavior, deviant, maladaptive, and personally distressful. Now today, when we start looking at anxiety disorder, we're going to be learning what it says, but we're also going to step back in our mind and reflect, what does it have to do with this larger framework? What is psychology? What is abnormal behavior? And what are the criteria? Okay. So we'll always be relating back to that, because that's what we're going to do with everything else the rest of the class, the whole semester. And then as we come, we will look at how the myelin sheath on the axon, on the brain cell, how when we stop and reflect, what does the strategy do that causes this to wrap around so that the transmission and speed of information is quicker and strengthens the dendrite. We're also going to be looking at how do I get information by reflecting into the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex looks at and is involved in decision making, problem solving, and all that stuff. If we just get it in the amygdala, whatever we're learning, we can pull it back up, but we can't think with it. We've got to get it here. To get it here, we have to reflect, and we have to organize. We have to do something so that we learn the factual information so we can remember it. We have to understand what we're learning, which today is going to be anxiety disorder in terms of this framework, and then how to organize the knowledge, which you have been doing with this kind of technique, mind mapping. Okay. So, the other thing, how are we doing so far? You doing good. Oh, that's great. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is when we're looking at anxiety disorders, the author has organized everything around comparing and contrasting abnormal behavior with normal behavior. And so when we're looking at all of these anxiety disorders, there's abnormal behavior, and they fall into abnormal behavior. But the behavior can be normal or abnormal based on, does it fit these criteria? And that's why we always relate back. It is a deeper, more fundamental way of thinking and learning. It's not surface learning where I memorize, can't remember, 2 weeks later it's gone. Now, the thing you have to do is pay close attention to everything going on, because you're going to be running across words like, can you see this?
Yes.
In contrast. What does in contrast mean? It means something that came before they explained, and then suddenly you're headed in the opposite direction. It's different than whatever came before. So in your mind, you need to refresh your mind. Psychology is about how the brain affects behavior. And the chapter 6, which is on psychological disorders, is about psychological disorders and explaining abnormal behavior, because that is the crux of psychological disorders. Is the behavior abnormal? Is behavior affecting thinking, behavior, or social interaction? And everything that we read, how does it relate to this? And then there's criteria for abnormal behavior. So when we're looking at anxiety disorders, is the anxiety disorder deviant, atypical behavior? Is it maladaptive, I'm a danger to myself or someone else, or I can't function daily? Or is it personally distressful over a long period of time? And we just keep looking at that. And we're going to have our psychiatrist in here. You want to see the psychiatrist? Wave your hand right there. Dr. Freud. And so from here, as we look at anxiety disorder, someone has come in and they're going to make a comparison always with every psychological disorder. They're going to make a comparison between what's normal behavior for that disorder, for anxiety. Any of you ever get anxious? Do you have a psychological disorder? What is normal? And what makes it abnormal? And that's the pattern that we will be looking for. Now the trick is, can you stop as you're learning this and reflect and use a cognitive strategy like internal dialogue? What do I already know about this? How can I use this? Can you do that? So let's start reading, and what I'm going to do is model this for the other instructors and yourselves at this point. Get a good shot of this guy right here. This is my regular cameraman right here. I have to get a written permission to have you on the camera. Oh, okay, he is just right there, said he'd do it. Okay. Look on page 147. Anxiety disorders. All of this conceptual framework we were building was about psychological disorders. A specific one is anxiety disorders. And so we've got anxiety disorders, and I'm going to, what do I know about anxiety disorders? Do I know anybody that gets so anxious that somehow it is personally distressful for them over a long period of time? It's deviant, it's just not atypical, it's not what we expect. Or they're a danger to themselves or to other people. It keeps them from even functioning. Does everyone, if you're paying attention, does everyone see how when I just, anxiety disorders stopped, had the internal conversation in my mind, but the internal conversation at this point always goes back to what we call the conceptual framework. It's your mind map that you created over what a psychological disorder is. And the criteria, so anxiety disorders, and I've got to think, what does that mean? Well, it's got something to do with the criteria for abnormal behavior. If someone, they could be personally distressful, I could picture that. I've seen people on television, have to blow in a bag, they got so anxious or what have you. And I've seen people who can't function because they become so anxious. In fact, I've seen people in classrooms when they're called upon become so anxious they can't function. Now, but is that over a long period of time or is that temporary? When we go to our psychiatrist over here and you come in, you've got anxiety, is it a psychological disorder? Does it meet these abnormal behavior criteria? So let's begin reading and see what we're reading here. Think about how you felt before a make or break exam. Anybody ever get test anxiety? Do you get it every time? Or there's some people get it in some situations and not others. Or a big presentation. You ever had to get up in front of class and get anxious? Or perhaps you noticed police lights flashing behind your speeding car. I've been anxious lots of times, okay? So, as I am reading this, and those little comments that I made, that was me having an internal dialogue. That was me stepping back and reflecting, what do I already know about this? So, in these instances, an exam, a presentation, a police car flashing behind me, I had a little conversation with myself. These are things I know about. I was tapping all the prior knowledge I have, wrapping the myelin sheath around psychological disorders so that the brain goes down this pathway very quickly and gets to what I already know and starts to learn it easily. It takes some re-exposure. To get the myelin sheath to grow, you've got to re-expose yourself. Now, did you feel jittery or anxious, nervous, or experience tightness in your stomach? Yes, 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 to all of those. These are the feelings of normal anxiety, an unpleasant feeling of fear and dread. So normal anxiety, unpleasant feeling, jittery, nervous stomach, of fear and dread. I'm giving a presentation, I'm dreading the presentation, I'm becoming anxious, I'm starting to forget, my stomach's jittery, what have you. They're saying that's normal. In your mind, you are creating that looked good, I'm sure. Okay. We're talking about anxiety, disorder, And it said that normal was these examples that they gave. I'm just gonna draw a quick picture. This is a car behind me with flashing lights. There's Dan. I think I'll put myself on a motorcycle so I'm cooler. Okay, here I am. And that's normal anxiety. I drew a quick picture that represents what's normal, because always they're going to try to make the distinction between these criteria. So it's not deviant, it's not maladaptive, it's not personally distressful, and so it's normal. Because the next sentence, and by the way, everything that I am saying, I'm not really talking to you, I'm having an internal dialogue in my head that gives me the repetition that connects to prior knowledge, that increases my dendrites everywhere in my brain, as well as build this myelin sheath that speeds up transmission. How does this, we just do that, how does this fit with this? It always relates back. It's got to do this. It either is or it isn't one of these criteria.